What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to episode 2 of Anecdotes and Observations. That's Ayo, pronounced Ayo! And today we're going to talk about periodization and programming. So I think often people don't know the distinction between the two, and it is sometimes just defined by the person talking about it. But I think probably the best way to think about periodization, it is indeed talking about periods of time. So it is talking more about your long-term goals, probably over a longer period of time, hence the word period, while programming has to do more with the day-to-day strategies within microcycle, within a week, or within maybe a block at most, like a mesocycle of 4 weeks, and within session. It's kind of setting up your split. Now, traditionally, bodybuilders have typically only thought about training within the week. They tell you which muscle groups they're training on which days, what rep ranges they're working in, and then largely they just try to work hard within that context, and they switch it up every, let's say, anywhere between 4 to 12 weeks, depending on the bodybuilder, the system they come from, how antsy in their pantsy they get when it comes time to switching movements, etc. While powerlifters typically have approach training with more planning in mind. They will do more higher volume, lower load, lower RPE, lower effort per set training farther away from competition, and they'll get more specific as they get closer to competition, using more assistance work further out, then doing more of their volume with the main lifts as they get closer, so they can build upon the weak points, build overall global hypertrophy to be stronger, to build their kind of capacity for strength, and then when they get close to competition, they drop the volume on everything else to be more specific so they can focus more energy onto their main lifts at a heavy load, similar to what they're going to do in competition to drop fatigue and peak. And that largely makes sense. Now, as you've probably heard me say or Alberto say, if you've been following 3DMJ, or Brad say for a long time, is that bodybuilders probably have something to learn from powerlifters. And while I think that is still true and that you want some level of organization, as we've had more and more data come out, especially a recent meta-analysis that found really no difference between periodization styles for hypertrophy, it's come to mind that perhaps that's not as black and white of a statement as it should be. And that maybe more of a focus on programming is all you need for hypertrophy, and periodization is something that is a little more important when you have a specific athletic goal like performance versus just global muscle mass development. Now, there's also another element of the definition of periodization which is worth talking about, which is that typically there's some kind of manipulation in the rep ranges you're working in and the volume and intensity over time. So for example, I'll give you some broad definitions. A linear periodized model just means that volume starts higher and then it goes lower as intensity goes up. That was kind of what I talked about with what powerlifters typically do. This can be done in kind of block periodization, where you do a volume block, an intensity block, then taper. Or it can be combined with other modes of periodization, like undulating periodization, where you might do, let's say, different repetitions on the same movement, different days of the week. So you might do like 8s on Monday, 6s on Wednesday, and then 4s on Friday when you're kind of further from competition. That becomes 5-3-1 when you're closer to competition. 5s on Mondays, 3s on Wednesdays, and singles on Friday. Just as an example, and that could be where you start with that undulation pattern and you end with that second undulation pattern. That would be a linear undulating program. It has elements of both. And certainly there is value in different periodization styles and formats for strength, and that's been relatively well established now in the last couple of years. I think in a recent meta-analysis that was published, and also an excellent article that was written by Greg Nuckols, where he basically did a kind of an open source article that was a meta-analysis on all the literature out there on periodization for strength. I'd definitely check out Stronger by Science if you want to read about that. And he found that indeed undulating models of periodization seem to be most effective, not hugely so, but more effective than non-periodized training and more effective than linear periodized training for trained lifters especially. So, and that definitely kind of goes hand in hand with what we see in the field with what powerlifters do. They're not just doing one repetition range for an entire 4 to 8 week period. Now, there's also a recent study that we covered in Mass where they compared the Hatfield system, which is a planned, thought-out system whereby you're training in 3 different repetition ranges within the same workout. So you're doing heavy, moderate, and then high rep based on the theory, which there is some empirical data on. In fact, there's an article that just came out by Brad Schoenfeld kind of hypothesizing with his co-authors that perhaps high rep, low load training might preferentially hypertrophy type 1 fibers, and perhaps vice versa, heavy load training or explosive training might better hypertrophy your fast twitch fibers. Now, this is definitely hypothetical. I'm not saying that is the case, but if it does indeed turn out to be that way, there is a rationale for doing various repetition zones for hypertrophy. And while we haven't really well investigated that, we do know that both high load and low load training, if it's to an appropriate effort level, so near to failure for high rep training, and probably if it's heavy enough, it doesn't need to be as close to failure. With heavy load training, both can stimulate hypertrophy if you match the number of sets. That's something we've seen repeated many, many, many times now. So we know that both high load and low load, and of course then moderate load training, are all effective for stimulating growth. But maybe, as we haven't really done many studies in this area, combining those different loading zones and repetition zones might be even better for hypertrophy. Then the question becomes, well, should we be doing it at the same time in different weeks and different days in different blocks? This recent study that I was mentioning, the Hatfield system, has you do it in the same day. So you'll start heavy, go moderate, then go light for the same movement or same muscle group at the very least. And this was compared to a weekly undulating plan. And it found, so basically you do same different repetition zones in subsequent weeks rather than in the same session. And there wasn't a difference between the two. Now, this is interesting because this is one of the few times where they found that a non-periodized program, and I'll explain why the Hatfield system is technically non-periodized, seemed to perform just as well for hypertrophy as the periodized system. Now, what I mean by non-periodized is that even though this is a well set up plan, and it had targeted repetition ranges and specific rest periods and a lot of things that make sense, and it's very logical, and it's based on the hypothesis that various repetition loading zones combined would be best for hypertrophy. It didn't actually change over time. The goal was just to either add load or add reps when you could within the repetition range. And that's essentially non-periodized because there's not a change. There's no undulation, right? It happens all in the same workout, so it's not daily undulating, it's not weekly undulating, and there's no linearity to it. You're not seeing significant drops in volume as intensity goes up. They're kind of just both going up as you can progress. So essentially what they compared was a programming strategy, if you will, without any element of long-term periodization to a weekly undulating periodized program, and they didn't find a difference in hypertrophy. Now again, a short-term study, we're not looking at long-time periods here, but also anecdotally, and this is kind of where we go back to the AAO aspect of this video. There are tons of bodybuilders who follow plans that I think are well thought out and meet a lot of the guidelines we would call evidence-based in terms of frequency, volume, and intensity, but don't actually periodize their training. And I would say probably a few years ago, I would have thought that maybe that's not a good thing. But I'm less convinced of that now. And I think that perhaps as a bodybuilder, as someone who's purely focused on hypertrophy, it's maybe just not that complex. Maybe it just has a lot more to do with fatigue management, effort level, appropriate volume, appropriate frequency, and perhaps multiple different loading zones. So both heavy and light training and moderate training to make sure you hit every aspect of the muscle group. And then, of course, intelligent exercise selection. So what this means is that perhaps a programming strategy is more important for a bodybuilder, while periodization is something that you may only need to focus on if you're a strength athlete or, of course, any other type of athlete. So what might that look like? Well, it means you could set up a training program for hypertrophy that was largely based around empirical guidelines from the meta-analyses we have, which is a brief overview of them all. That means training each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week, doing at least 10 sets per muscle group per week, and then using perhaps a variety of loading zones. So probably training anywhere in the, I would say 4 to 20 rep range. and then making sure that you're training at an appropriate effort level. So I would say anything that's over 15, so let's say 12, anything in the 12 to 20 rep range, you want to be taking that to probably an 8 to 10 RPE, somewhere in there. Being smart about when you do that 10 RPE so that it's probably when you're finishing up a muscle group. So if you're going to do, say, overhead press and also lateral raises, you wouldn't want to be hitting 10 RPEs on the overhead press. It's going to make you get less volume on each subsequent set of overhead press, and then you're probably going to have to do lateral raises lighter. So maybe save that 10 RPE stuff for your last couple sets of lateral raises, as an example. And then, you don't have to go to failure, and you probably don't want to when you're in the moderate and moderately heavy repetition ranges. Right around 80 to 90% of 1RM, you're getting almost max motor unit recruitment from the word go, from the first rep. So let's say you're doing, your 8 rep max or lower. I'd say you can certainly use lower RPE ranges to kind of manage fatigue and allow yourself to get more volume. Because if you go to failure right from the get-go, it's going to tank a lot of the volume you can do for the rest of the session and affect following sessions. So I'd say probably in the, say, 6 to 9 RPE range for your heavy compound movements that are done in the 4 to 8 rep range, and then you can push it up to an 8 to 10 RPE as you do your isolation movements, your machine movements that are coming later in that session. So that's kind of the different loading zones, different RPEs, and then probably not a bad idea to just think about having like high volume, low volume, high stress, low stress days. So let's say you train each muscle group twice per week. You could have a harder day, an easier day, maybe a heavy day, and then a lighter day that's more volume. Space them out and just think about overlap of exercises. So long as you're training each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week, so long as you're training each muscle group with at least 10 plus sets, so long as you're thinking about training to failure so that it's not so much that it's actually impeding your recovery, and then just trying to progress in reps or load when possible. And then when you do stall, assessing whether it's an issue of fatigue management or just you need to actually induce more overload than the current volume level is providing. So that means, okay, do I need to change my deload schedule? Do I need to limit my RPEs? Do I need to just focus on my nutrition and my sleep? Or am I just expecting too much while I'm dieting? Those are all the fatigue management side of it. And on the other hand, well, I'm actually feeling fine. I'm just can't progress. And that's progressing in a reasonable time frame for your training age. So that means, if you're a novice bodybuilder, if you're not seeing progress, say, week to week, that might be an issue if you can't even add 1 rep, But if you're more intermediate, if you can't see it like, mesocycle to mesocycle, month to month, but if you're more advanced and you can't see, say, every 12 weeks some kind of addition of, improving your AMRAPs or something like that. If that's not happening, then perhaps if you are recovered, that's when it's time to actually add more volume. Go from, say, 12 sets per muscle group to 14 to see if you can do that, or just on the muscle groups where you're stalled. And that's a very valid way to train. That's technically not periodized, right? Because you aren't changing on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis what you're doing. You're just trying to add reps or add load when you can, and then you're just setting up your microcycle in a evidence-based manner within those guidelines. I think there's nothing wrong with that. So I think that's just a useful way to think about it, and it does relieve a little bit of that stress of having to understand the more complex aspects of training as an athlete. And it does explain why there's been so many successful bodybuilders who just primarily put in hard work with the solid basic template, and they do pretty well. Do I think there's never a time for periodization for bodybuilders? No. I think that's certainly not a bad idea, and with many of my more advanced lifters who are bodybuilders, I do take them through blocks of higher volume and then higher intensity. So they might be working in, say, the 8 to 15 rep range, and then the 4 to 10 rep range for a 4-week block and a 4-week block, and then we'll test AMRAPs at like 90% of their pre-test estimated 1RM and see if they can improve their AMRAP at the end of that after a deload. So I think that's still pretty reasonable, but the basic template of what days they train what and what movements they do will roughly stay the same. I'll just change the RPEs and change the loading zones, if that makes sense. Now, for powerlifters, definitely you probably should have some element of periodization to what you're doing. As you get closer to a competition, you probably want to taper, and you probably want to be practicing like you're going to perform on the platform. You should probably have more squat, bench, and deadlift in your competition form, and they should probably be in the low repetition ranges and pretty heavy. You probably want to practice your openers a week out, and you want to get more specific as you get closer to actually performing that task. And I think there's many ways to skin that cat. But if you were to just follow a programming strategy where you were just always doing fives or something like that, I think after you were a novice, you'd probably be leaving a little something on the table. You'd probably be progressing a little slower, and we actually have the empirical data to back that up. So this episode of AO, I'm going to conclude by saying that hypertrophy, because it's not a specific skill of expressing strength on a specific movement for a specific 1 rep max, a lot of ways to get there. And so long as you set it up within the guidelines of what we think makes sense, like once again, 2 to 3 times per week per muscle group, and then 10 plus sets depending on your training age and what you can handle and where you've been previously, and then controlling RPE and having effective exercise selection that makes sense for your goals and your limitations. If there's any injuries or range of motion, all that stuff, check out the training muscle and strength training pyramid to get really specific guidelines there. Then I think that's probably the way to go. And the final caveat is that those are the averages from meta-analyses. Your mileage may vary. In fact, it's more than likely that it will, and especially as your training age increases. You may need to train each muscle group 4 times, or you may get better results. I shouldn't say need, because you'll probably grow on both, but you might get better results training each muscle group 4 times per week with 20 sets per week. Or you might be on the other end of the spectrum where you get a high growth response to training and a high fatigue response, and you decide to only train each muscle group 1.5 times per week with about 8 sets per body part. And that's like an example of that would be like, on the first one I described would probably be like a me or an Alberto Nunez. We found from trial and error that we do better with higher frequency, higher volume. And then Jeff Alberts on the other end of the spectrum has found that more kind of low to moderate volume with a low to moderate frequency he responds better to. So again, you're going to fall anywhere kind of in that spectrum of 1 or 2 standard deviations away from those averages, but that's a really good place to start. And then if you're a power lifter, just make sure you get more specific as you get close to your competition. And that's pretty much it, folks. The difference between programming and periodization. Periodization includes programming and then changes it over time and follows some different types of templates. While programming can stay relatively static and you're just trying to induce progressive overload when you can, and then you just have to assess when you are stalled because of a recoverability issue. Fatigue management then becomes the goal, and potentially changing the way you train so that you can recover, or whether you simply need to add more volume to what you're doing. If you're already training with a high effort level, with a fixed volume, and you just simply cannot add reps or load, even though it's been, say, a couple weeks as a novice, or a month or 2 for an intermediate, or say 3 to 4 months for an advanced person. All right, folks, that's all I got for you. Thanks for tuning into AEO, and I will see you next time.